They knew he was coming. It was inevitable. By now, the entire Eastern Mediterranean had heard the astonishing news. A relatively newly crowned Macedonian king named Alexander III, commanding perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 men, had twice defeated the armies of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. First at the Granicus River in northwestern Asia Minor in May of 334 BC, and then again at Issus in November of 333 BC. At Issus, he had faced the great king himself, Darius III, and shattered a Persian army that likely outnumbered his own by at least 2 to 1. The great king of Persia had then fled the field and headed eastward to regroup and raise new forces. But Alexander didn't pursue him. Instead, he turned south. City after city along the Levantine coast fell into his hands. Some opened their gates willingly, others resisted. The island city of Tyre chose defiance when Alexander requested to enter and make a sacrifice to Heracles. For 7 months, from January to July of 332 BC, Tyre held out. In response, Alexander undertook one of the most audacious engineering feats of the ancient world. He ordered the construction of a massive causeway across the sea, linking the mainland to the island city's fortress. Slowly, but relentlessly, his men advanced along it. Siege towers rolled forward, and his naval forces blockaded the harbor. At last, the walls of the city were breached. Thousands of the city's defenders were killed, with many of the surviving inhabitants sold into slavery. Tyre would resist no more, nor would it ever be the same. Not long after, between September and November of 332 BC, Alexander reached Gaza. The city and its governor, Batis, resisted fiercely for 2 months. But Gaza too was stormed, its defenders slain, and, like Tyre, much of the population enslaved. News of these events traveled swiftly further southwest to Egypt. Just 5 years earlier, few outside Macedonia had ever heard his name. Now, everyone knew who Alexander III of Macedon was, and we of course know him today as Alexander the Great. The classical historian and biographer Arrian, whose Anabasis of Alexander is one of the most detailed early accounts of his life, tells us the following. Alexander now started for Egypt, and after a 6 days' march from Gaza, reached Egyptian Pelusium. His navy had been voyaging along the coast from Phoenicia to Egypt, and he found it moored at Pelusium. When Alexander arrived at Pelusium, on Egypt's eastern frontier, the Persian satrap Mazakis faced a stark reality. He had few troops at his disposal. Many had marched north to support Darius III at Issus and had not returned, and reinforcements from the great king were unlikely. Alexander's fleet also controlled the coast, and the fate of Tyre and Gaza was by now well known to him. Arrian tells us, Mazakis the Persian, who had been appointed satrap of Egypt by Darius, had been informed about the Battle of Issus and about Darius's disgraceful flight and the fact that Phoenicia, Syria, and the greater part of Arabia were in Alexander's power. Possessing no Persian force himself, Mazakis received Alexander hospitably in the cities and the country. Thus, Mazakis peacefully handed over Egypt, along with approximately 800 talents of silver, to the Macedonian king. And so, without a battle, Egypt passed from Persian rule into the hands of Alexander. Having received the submission of Egypt, Alexander might have been expected to press on immediately toward his next military objective, as he had done after each of his previous victories, and continue his pursuit of Darius III and the rest of the Persian Empire eastward. Instead, he turned south and made his way toward Egypt's ancient capital, Memphis, where he would formally assume control of the country. Whatever his precise motivations may have been, Egypt itself seems to have exerted a powerful attraction on the young Macedonian conqueror, for Alexander had now entered one of the oldest and most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient Near East, a land whose traditions stretched back thousands of years. In particular, the traditional ideology of the pharaohs, of an all-powerful, transcendent monarchy established by divine right, appears to have resonated strongly with Alexander's own evolving sense of kingship. And so, in November of 332 BC, after installing a garrison at Pelusium to secure the eastern gateway into the Nile Delta, and ordering his fleet to sail upriver, Alexander himself set out overland. His first destination was the ancient cult center of the sun god, Ra, at Heliopolis. The historian Arrian tells us, Alexander established a garrison at Pelusium, and after commanding his officers to sail up the river as far as Memphis, he himself proceeded to Heliopolis, keeping the Nile on his right. After taking control of all the places along his route, they were all surrendered by their inhabitants, he crossed the desert and arrived at Heliopolis. From there, with the Nile flowing on his right, Alexander continued his march toward the old royal capital of Memphis. Arrian continues, he reached that city through the desert, after gaining possession of all the places along the march through the voluntary surrender of the inhabitants. Thence he crossed the river and came to Memphis. While in Memphis, Alexander took great care to respect Egyptian religious traditions. He paid proper reverence to the sacred bull, Hep, whom the Greeks called Apis, and, out of respect, and perhaps fear that his men might loot the site, he ordered his soldiers to keep away from the Saqqara necropolis that overlooked the city. Alexander also carried out the traditional ceremonies that officially made him pharaoh, rituals that had been performed in Egypt since the earliest days of its history. Like every ruler before him, he adopted the royal titles of an Egyptian king. One of these was the throne name, Setepenra Meryahmun, meaning chosen of Ra, beloved of Amun. Like the great pharaohs before him, Alexander also ordered the construction and restoration of temples throughout Egypt. Many of these projects were centered in the south, around the ancient city of Waset, better known by its Greek name, Thebes, and today called Luxor. However, most historians believe that Alexander himself never actually visited the city. By now, Alexander had conquered more cities and territories than any Greek before him, and he was only 24. Alexander had achieved an extraordinary amount in a very short time. Military victories, acquiring massive wealth, and his growing reputation for success had begun to give him an almost godlike status. At the same time, there were rumors about Alexander's own origins. According to one story, his mother, Olympias, had not conceived him with King Philip II of Macedon at all, but with the god Amun, who was the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus. Whether this story was simply propaganda promoted by Alexander, or perhaps an Egyptian attempt to connect their new pharaoh to their own religious traditions, is impossible to know. Whatever the reason, Alexander decided to travel more than 300 miles across the Libyan desert to visit the famous Oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis. There, he hoped to receive divine guidance, both about his own identity and about the future of his campaign. He may have also sought the god's blessing for his next great project, the founding of a new city that would bear his name, Alexandria. Of these things, Arrian tells us, on reaching Canobus, he sailed around Lake Mareotis and disembarked at the site of present-day Alexandria, the city named after him. The site struck him as very beautiful for a new settlement, and he imagined that a city founded there would prosper. A sudden passion for the project seized him, and he himself marked out where the agora was to be built and decided how many temples were to be erected and to which gods they were to be dedicated. The Greek gods and Egyptian Isis, and where the wall was to be built around the city. With these plans in mind, he offered sacrifices, and the omens proved favorable. A sudden desire now seized Alexander to visit and consult Amun in Libya, both because the Oracle of Amun was said to be trustful, and because Perseus and Heracles had consulted it. The former when he was sent against the Gorgon by Polydectes, the latter when he was seeking Antaeus in Libya and Busiris in Egypt. Alexander was engaged in a rivalry with Perseus and Heracles, as both heroes were his kinsmen. Moreover, he traced his own birth to Amun, just as the myths traced the births of Perseus and Heracles to Zeus. In any case, he set out with this in mind, and imagined that he would obtain more precise knowledge of his own affairs, or at least would say he had obtained it. The pilgrimage to the oasis became a legendary tale filled with wonder. While some records claim Alexander marched straight through the harshest parts of the desert, he likely followed the safer coastal road before turning inland. The stories of the trip are full of miracles, with some historians claiming that the army was guided by a group of crows, and others insisting that 2 talking snakes led the way. Ancient descriptions of the oasis itself are vivid, featuring a magical spring of the sun that was ice cold during the day and warmed up at night. The god's image, encrusted with emeralds, was said to be carried on a golden boat by 80 priests. These priests did not choose their own path. Instead, they moved without their own volition, going wherever the god directed them to provide his answers. The most famous moment occurred during the private interview between Alexander and the high priest at Siwa. Most historical sources agree that Alexander was hailed as the Son of Amun. While this was a traditional title for a pharaoh, Alexander seems to have taken the claim very seriously, and perhaps literally. From that point on, his devotion to the god was clear. He sacrificed to Amun regularly, and eventually requested to be buried at his shrine. However, this divine claim created a massive rift between Alexander and his men. His Macedonian soldiers often mocked him for claiming a divine father and disowning his, let's say, worldly father, King Philip II, whom many of them had loyally served before Alexander became king. Beyond the questions of his birth, Alexander reportedly asked the oracle if he would rule the entire world, to which he received a firm yes. His final question was whether all of his fathers, meaning Philip II's, murderers had been punished. When the oracle confirmed they had been, it provided Alexander with a great sense of relief. Once back in Egypt, the now officially recognized pharaoh Alexander continued to work on his new city, Alexandria, the first of many. Alexander only stayed in Egypt for 6 to 7 months. While there, the Achaemenid Persian king, Darius III, had been assembling a new army for another decisive confrontation, this time more on his terms. At the same time, troubling news reached Alexander from Greece. King Aegeus III of Sparta had begun organizing a revolt against Macedonia on the Greek mainland. Several Aegean islands had also joined the uprising, and Aegeus had even gained control of Crete. Alexander responded by dispatching a naval force under Amphoterus to deal with the crisis, while responsibility for Greece itself remained in the hands of his regent, Antipater. Yet, as Alexander pushed deeper into Asia, events in Greece became less central to his ambitions. By early summer of 331 BC, Alexander had left Egypt behind. Marching north and then east, he crossed the Euphrates at Thapsakis in his pursuit of Darius III and the Achaemenid throne. In the end, he would not only defeat Darius and seize control of the Persian Empire, but venture even farther east into the vast lands of Central Asia and ultimately into India, farther than any European army had ever gone before, and in truth, farther than most would venture again until the modern age. But Alexander would never return to Egypt. After years of relentless campaigning across Asia, he eventually made his way back west, arriving in the ancient city of Babylon in 323 BC. There, at just 32 years old, Alexander fell suddenly ill. After several days of fever, the conqueror, who had marched from Greece to the edges of the known world, died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon. With the throne vacant and no clear heir, the vast empire Alexander had stitched together began to unravel almost immediately. In the chaotic power vacuum that came to a head, 2 kings were eventually recognized to maintain a facade of unity. Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Arihideus, and his posthumous son, Alexander IV. In Egypt, these 2 were officially acknowledged as pharaohs, their names even carved into the sacred walls of temples like Karnak and Luxor in traditional cartouches. However, neither ever actually set foot in the Nile Valley. Their reigns were tragically short and served only as a stay of execution for the Argead Dynasty. Philip III was executed in Macedonia in 317 BC, and by 310 or 309 BC, the young Alexander IV and his mother Roxana were murdered on the orders of Antipater's son, Cassander. While these young kings were meeting their ends in Greece, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted generals and childhood friends, was playing a far more calculated, long game. During the initial division of the empire, Ptolemy had specifically requested the governorship of Egypt, recognizing its natural defenses and immense agricultural wealth. He secured his legitimacy through a bold act of body snatching, intercepting Alexander's funeral procession as it traveled toward Macedonia and diverting the conqueror's mummified remains to Egypt. By burying Alexander in Egypt, Ptolemy signaled to the world that he was the rightful successor to Alexander's legacy. By 305 BC, with Alexander's bloodline officially extinguished, Ptolemy dropped all pretenses and declared himself king of Egypt. This transition marked the birth of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Hellenistic power that would rule the Nile Valley for nearly 300 years, transforming Egypt into the intellectual and economic heart of the Mediterranean world until the dynasty's final fall to the Romans under Cleopatra VII. We'll get to that story in a future episode. For now, thanks for watching. I'd also like to thank the channel's patrons for making videos like this possible. These include, but are certainly not limited to, GrandKick69, Yap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Danny Van Eck, Wenix TV, Robert Morgan, Strobex, Blitzkrieg, Krishnan Murali, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Notaro Correa, Michael Trudell, Leader Titan, Micah G, John Scarberry, William O'Brien, Andrew Bomer, Connor Dolson, Krish, Ben Van Rysvik, David R., Stephen Ball, Gabe, Monty Grimes, Franz Robbins, Cyrus Mir, Diane Nastra, Nimrod Nir, Hypnosan, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Anahita Debu, Gulistan Debu, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and X, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.